Hey everyone, welcome back to the Chain Reaction Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Shaughnessy, a co-founder at Delphi Digital, which is an independent research boutique providing institutional-grade analysis on the digital asset market. One quick housekeeping item. This podcast is strictly informational and educational and is not investment advice or a solicitation to buy or sell any tokens or securities or to make any financial decisions. For full disclosures, please see the show notes below. Also, our listeners can visit delphidigital.io and use coupon code CHAINREACTION in all caps as a special offer to access our research. The top crypto funds, analysts, and firms read Delphi Digital's research. With that out of the way, today I'm thrilled to have on Joe Lubin, the co-founder of Ethereum and the founder of ConsenSys. For those new to the space, ConsenSys is a global blockchain technology company building the infrastructure, applications, and practices that enable a decentralized world. ConsenSys has over 50 spokes building on Ethereum, ranging from infrastructure like Infura and Metamask to platforms and applications like OpenLaw and Airswap. After having numerous guests from ConsenSys on the podcast, ranging from Gregory Rocco to Andrew Keys and others, it was excellent to have Joe on to explain his take on the space and his vision for the future. We cover the goals of blockchain overall, Ethereum's competition, its future under Serenity, and the past, present, and future of ConsenSys, and so much more. Joe's by far one of the most plugged-in people to the space. As such, this was a very insightful conversation. With that, let's jump into the episode. Joe, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for hopping on with me. I don't think anybody is new to your story, so I think we could skip the general introductions and jump right in because I know you're busy. So I'd love to begin with Ethereum, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about how Ethereum's changed over time. I guess, do you think it's natural and understandable to evolve over time? Or do you think a lot of the growing pains we're kind of seeing now is natural?
Definitely natural. It was always intended to evolve. I think even Bitcoin was intended to evolve, although one could understand the case that it should perhaps evolve more slowly, possibly even at glacial speeds. If you're building a decentralized money system intended for the planet, maybe you don't want rapid growth in your technology. But we, from the start, intended to do something very different from Bitcoin, using the same technological principles. We intended to build a platform for decentralized applications. And as an application platform, of course, you need to keep getting more capable and evolve as technology evolves. We also knew that we were, doing something that everybody believed we couldn't really do. And so got that done. But B, essentially building a proof of concept, a sort of toy decentralized application platform, certainly an incredibly sophisticated system and ecosystem. But very early on, we were aware that it wouldn't be scalable. It wouldn't have privacy and confidentiality. It would support certain kinds of use cases, but the ultimate goal was to build a decentralized technology, a platform that would show the world the way to build better infrastructure, better decentralized foundations, better decentralized trust systems. And Ethereum 1.0 was always intended to be the starting point. It was intended to enable a bunch of use cases, and it's enabled essentially a better kind of money, potentially, although we shied away from trying to position it as a money system. It's enabled experiments in lots of different spaces, in the energy industry, in supply chain, in banking, insurance, and healthcare, and it's enabled token launches, different kinds of token launches. It's enabled this DeFi revolution, or this DeFi phenomenon that's hockey sticking right now. So you mentioned growing pains. I think growing pains are essential and wonderful. If we didn't grow quite dramatically, if we didn't grow to the point where there were pains, then I think it could be argued that we're moving too slowly as an ecosystem. And so I'm pretty proud of the Ethereum project, pretty proud of the governance. Certainly, everything about Ethereum needs to improve, and there are lots of people that are working to improve virtually everything about Ethereum.
So it seems to me that Ethereum's getting a better class of competitors. EOS, I think, was okay, arguably. I don't think it was great. But now you have Tezos, Cosmos, Polkadot, and Infinity coming on. They're all going to be online soon or within the next year. Do you see the competition as making the whole blockchain pie larger, or do you think this is competition that could potentially, eat Ethereum's lunch at some point?
Probably both. Although, by both I mean good events anywhere in our ecosystem lifts all boats. And some projects are certainly intending to be competitive with Ethereum. Some projects are focusing on marketing to be competitive with Ethereum. So I would put Tron and EOS in that basket, and both of them have kind of taken the approach of sort of raise a bunch of money and fake it till you make it, basically. And we'll see how that goes. And there are other good projects in the space, many of which have had close ties to Ethereum right from the start. And it's an amazingly collaborative ecosystem. There's certainly lots of competition going on a daily basis, but we all are very friendly, pretty much, and run into each other at conferences multiple times a year around the world. And the amazing thing about this technological moment in time, or this particular technology, is that it is all done out in the open. So open source is the ethos. Open source approaches are necessary. There's a ton of communication and collaboration going on between competing teams. And so we're all kind of competing on either marketing or drawing the best talent to our project and building out the strongest ecosystem. You really can't build one of these platforms closed and hope to achieve the buy-in, hope to build an ecosystem. Definity is a notable exception, and they're closed source right now, and I think they're going to have trouble gaining the trust of community builders. And if you unleash an open source project onto the world and it's fully formed, the developers, maybe a few of them would be interested in that, but people really want to contribute. People really want to be in there early on, and that's how you get the real buy-in. So in the context of this openness, this collaboration and communication, Ethereum has, in my opinion, the best technology by a lot, the best technologists, and so many more of them, and orders of magnitude bigger ecosystem, and I feel like the project is moving faster. And so in that open context, we can all steal liberally from one another, and it won't be hard for Ethereum to, I believe, maintain an ecosystem lead and at minimum stay up to speed technologically. I would argue that Ethereum 2.0 will become significant before any other of those projects really become significant. So Polkadot, Tezos, Cosmos, Definity will all probably release something interesting within a year. And it looks like phase 0 of Serenity, Ethereum 2.0, will probably come online towards the end of this year. There are 8 teams currently that are building out clients. Several of them have their own test nets already, and some of the teams are pairing off to get in sync with one another very soon. There's some events planned to do some of that, and so I feel like within a handful of months, all of the different client teams will be syncing with one another on a single test net, and probably before the end of this year, Ethereum 2.0 phase 0, the beacon chain, the heartbeat of the system, proof of stake element, is likely to be in a position, or maybe early next year, to provide some value to Ethereum 1.0. So it may end up fairly quickly serving as a finality gadget for transactions for blocks on Ethereum 1.
That's great color, Joe. So, moving forward with ETH 2.0, are there any critiques that you have for how things played out so far? Or, if you could go back in time a year, do you think that there's anything you would change about the Ethereum's community the Ethereum community's approach to Ethereum 2.0, whether it be the roadmap or the technologies or the focus?
I'm not generally inclined to point at moments in the past and say we did something wrong. Everything we do together is a learning moment, and I think one really good example is just looking at proof of stake. One of the first things we all agreed on in sort of the first week of my participation on the Ethereum project in January of 2014 was that it should be a proof of stake blockchain. And fairly soon after, we came to the conclusion that there were edge cases in proof of stake systems that were in existence that we couldn't solve, and we were concerned that they could be problematic. We knew we could make proof of work, and so it was decided that we would do that, and we would keep working on proof of stake. Fast forward some number of years, and the Ethereum project has, with an R&D team in the lead on this particular issue, has explored lots of different approaches to proof of stake. And if you look at Vitalik's tweet storm describing all of the learnings along the way, you really get a beautiful snapshot or trajectory of how a incredibly sophisticated system is constructed by trying things, making assumptions, disconfirming those directions, and zeroing in on the strongest solution currently known. And you can only get there by exploring and identifying all the subtleties in the situation and really defining terms that you didn't even know about at the start of the journey. It is certainly looking like Casper proof of stake will not only be the most secure system out there, but it'll enable the greatest decentralization because it won't suffer from efficiencies of scale that enable large scale installations to benefit unduly, and the barrier to entry to actually validating transactions will be very low. So we believe that adoption will be very broad. You'll be able to implement it on not too sophisticated devices, and it'll burn extremely little electricity. And so better system. And one really interesting side effect is that system will enable us to bring the full validator pool, the security of the full validator pool to every one of the 1,024 shards on Ethereum 2.0. So it's not like you are splitting your entire validator pool into 1,000 different pools.
It's great. And Joe, circling back, I think it was a great point that you brought up that Ethereum is being built out in the open. A lot of people point to that and they, pick out a governance problem or they pick out a growth pain and they, compare it to another blockchain or a crypto. But I think it would be kind of fair to say that if other competing blockchains were as big with as many stakeholders, they would also be facing those public growing pains. Is that a fair assumption?
Sure, absolutely. Anytime you get a group of people together, they're going to have different opinions. If you get a group of people together that are building a system that lots of people care about and in which there is embedded billions of dollars worth of value, you're going to get strongly voiced opinions. And in that context, it's actually remarkable how well we all get along with one another. And I kind of feel like any of the issues are often generated by trolls, by nameless trolls on Reddit, where they pick off somebody who's doing good work and drive that person crazy. It's, there are a lot of thankless jobs in our ecosystem, and it's not the people that work with that person every single day that are having problems. It's sort of the financial class or the speculative class that is stressing about those sorts of elements, whereas there are lots of big challenges technologically to what we're all doing, but we're just focused on understanding what the challenges are and solving them. So there aren't a lot of people stressing too much about the price of the token and taking shots at people for that reason. There's some of that, certainly. There's some technological debates and teams with different approaches to virtual machines and stuff like that, but that's natural. You need strong dissenting opinions in order to come up with a better synthesis.
Switching over to kind of a broader question here. I mean, Bitcoin appears to be the dominant store of value, and I buy the macro argument, the diversification, the uncorrelated returns. I buy all of that, but a lot of people segment off Ethereum as the base layer for smart contracts and dApps use cases in that mind. But I think a lot of people argue that even if that's the case, Ethereum may still have to compete to be a store of value, and then it will then just have to compete with Bitcoin anyway. Do you think that the selling point is the same on the store of value for Ethereum or Bitcoin, or do you think that they should be, fundamentally separated in people's minds here?
Not fundamentally separated. So they definitely have different goals as systems, but both rely on the use of the token and the value of the token for security on those networks, on each network. I would argue that there are some countries, some use cases that really benefit from the use cases that Bitcoin affords. But in much of the world, there aren't a lot of things that I can't do or that other people can't do with their credit cards and other systems. Ethereum, we never positioned the Ether token as a money. We were really careful about avoiding that sort of languaging because we did some heavy legal work at the start of the project, and we were disciplined about how we languaged everything. It is, and it was and is a decentralized application platform, and the Ether token is a fuel that enables people to run applications and store data on the platform. As such, Ethereum is its own intrinsic economy. And so as there's more and more activity on the platform, there will be greater and greater demand for that value token to run applications in that economy. And so I feel like it's all about adoption. We've built a sophisticated technological foundation layer, the protocol, and we're starting to build a whole lot of different financial components, lending platforms, different kinds of tokens, atomic swap protocols, derivatives, parameterized insurance products, and that's growing really rapidly. And that's another enabling layer. So at ConsenSys, we build lots of applications for companies, banks, central banks, governments that are in different verticals. And some of those are starting actually to make use of public blockchain. So we just announced recently that we have built with a company called CapBridge a private equity exchange that will be regulated by the Monetary Authority of Singapore and will be deployed on public Ethereum, public mainnet. So as we see more and more utilization and more sophisticated sort of consumer layer or corporate layer use of the technology, the token, the Ether token, is going to increase in value. And I think it will start getting used as money because it's just a better, more programmable money than Bitcoin can be. And, with the different kinds of wallets that we've already built and, essentially arbitrary logic that we can build into money really quite easily. I think it's going to inhabit that use case as well.
Makes a lot of sense. So switching back to the ecosystem, you hit on DeFi a little bit earlier, and I think the movement is interesting on Ethereum. But my real question there is the building blocks that developers are building for DeFi, other application developers can use these blocks, compose them into new applications. So it seems like the things people can build on Ethereum are one level ahead of what they could build on anything else, because on other blockchains, they have to build these building blocks to begin with: stablecoins, prediction markets, decentralized exchanges. How strong of a moat do you think that is? Or do you think it's just too early to call it a moat because a lot of them are smaller type projects?
I think it's fair to call it a moat. I don't think the Ethereum ecosystem is trying to build a moat around itself. I do think that our company and others in the space are interested in seeing essentially an internet of blockchains or an internet of decentralized protocols where we have automated trust and guaranteed execution of agreements on platforms like Ethereum. And I think Ethereum is the platform that's most focused on maximal decentralization. And so I think it's far and away the only candidate to be the base trust layer, the base settlement layer for the planet. Got a long way to go before we can handle anything like that. But other protocols for decentralized storage and bandwidth and heavy compute and identity and proof of location, et cetera, all need to be linked in really smoothly to systems like Ethereum. And so it's about building out the Web3 world. It's not for us, at least, about building moats around Ethereum. That said, the standards, the talent, the interoperability between lots of different projects, essentially every project that you put up on Ethereum mainnet is now sitting in the same execution space as every other project, and you can wire those things up very easily. So I'm very confident that Ethereum will remain significant for quite a long time. There's so much going on with respect to layer 2 scalability, and I think that's going to it's really going to keep a lot of developers very busy while we bring the different pieces, phase 0, 1, and 2, and later on 4 of Ethereum 2.0 online. Without the need for moats, I think that Ethereum is going to continue to surge.
It's awesome. So switching over to ConsenSys, Joe, you've grown a lot really fast, 0 to 1,200 people, trimmed back a little. But my more pressing question here is, how has the ecosystem of ConsenSys changed over the years? If you were to walk in the office at the start of each day for the last couple of years, what's the difference between the teams pitching you or the leaders you're finding? How's the dynamic now versus then?
dramatic change. So ConsenSys has been many different companies over the last 4 1/3 years. We were a cute little venture production boutique trying to explore the thesis that decentralized applications were reasonable things to build and that you might consider wrapping a company around a decentralized application. And that might be a viable business. I'm not sure we've proven that yet, but I think many in our ecosystem believe that that is a valid hypothesis. So way back then, it wasn't clear to people that that with these programs on public blockchain that somebody wouldn't come along and just duplicate your program and cut your margins to nothing. It was clear to people who had some experience that the software alone does not a company make or a product make, and just the smart contract element is a small element to delivering something very valuable. So we started as a venture production studio. We ended up realizing that it's hard to build decentralized applications. So the first major phase was building the infrastructure, building Truffle and MetaMask and Infura, and later on some other infrastructural elements that we needed in order to pursue our goal of being a venture production studio, building products, essentially. We were in an interesting position, so we ended up getting calls from companies and banks and central banks and governments, and got a lot of visits, and people wanted to pay us for advisory work and then to build a whole bunch of POCs, and starting a couple years ago to build sophisticated production systems. And so we ended up sort of out of necessity building a professional services group. When you're creating an ecosystem, we were significant drivers in the opening of this ecosystem. The technology is immature, the products are immature, and so you have to do a tremendous amount of education and handholding. And we were fortunate enough to be in a position to do that with different entities, and we learned a lot. We built products from those situations, and we're now able to deliver much more mature products and compose those into sophisticated solutions for different industries. We started doing a bunch of investing because our ecosystem started to grow pretty rapidly and draw entrepreneurs and companies into it. And so we felt that we needed to not just keep our focus internally, but start to pay much more attention to what was going on around the world with other protocols and with projects in the Ethereum ecosystem. Right now, we're at a phase where a lot of our technologies, I wouldn't call them mature, but they're getting, we're sort of proud of them, and they're getting more mature, and we are able to compose them into things that are delivering real value to different companies or consortia or public blockchain or the public ecosystem. So we're focusing on streamlining upon the foundation that we built. We've got essentially a core stack. We're doing a ton of work in fintech and DeFi. We're looking at building a game component suite. We are doing a lot of work in supply chain and future work. We have many projects in the future workspace that we have been dogfooding internally, and some of them are starting to be used externally. And other narrower verticals like healthcare and media, entertainment, ad tech.
That's awesome, Joe. And one question I have to ask is, people saw the news on revenue for ConsenSys, and I don't really agree with the pushback, because I don't view you guys as a let's make a ton of money right now. I view you guys as seeding the dozens of companies that could potentially be a big deal in the future. Incubate, accelerate them, et cetera. What's your take there? I mean, is that the goal of ConsenSys for a lot of the spokes or subsidiaries, or is the focus revenue tomorrow? I just don't think that is the focus.
So we've been around for over 4 years. Our goal was to do whatever we could to educate, facilitate adoption, project the technology as far and wide as we could. And a couple years ago, we started having certain projects get commercial. We sort of backed into it. We weren't really setting that as a goal, but we started in, say, 2017, pulling in some revenue. It was single-digit $1 million. And within the last 12 to 18 months, we've started focusing much more on return on investment. So that's monetary return on investment, it's ecosystem return on investment, it's social impact. We're working on ways to measure all of that and ways to just get excellent across the board. So it is less about doing cool things at ConsenSys these days and more about recognizing that, hey, we played a significant role in opening up this ecosystem, and now everybody's streaming into it, and we need to be fully tooled up to compete in this ecosystem. And so the numbers that you saw published represent a trajectory that could be essentially one of the fastest growing software companies in history. So we're not embarrassed about how we're doing commercially at this point.
That's awesome. So Joe, building on that point, I've always been waiting. It just seems obvious to me, or like a natural parallel for, Microsoft to buy a chunk or Amazon to get involved. But then on the other side, it also looks like ConsenSys with Ethereum is kind of competing with the cloud providers. Has that ever crossed your mind to get more involved there? I know you guys obviously have Kaleido with AWS, but it just seems like at some point Microsoft could come knocking.
I'm not sure what you're asking. Get involved where?
I guess get involved either from Microsoft taking investment or just maybe more involved from the products or an infrastructure perspective with their cloud services.
So we've been working reasonably closely on and off with Microsoft for a few years. We were the first group that announced blockchain as a service on Azure. Microsoft's run with that over time. Our Kaleido group, which has built by far the most sophisticated blockchain as a service platform on the planet, they actually came out of IBM. They were the team that built version 1, 2, and 3 for IBM's Fabric of blockchain as a service. So they're just crushing it. They started on AWS. They are now on Azure, and there are some other excellent thing. When are we broadcasting? Because I don't want to give anything away. They're going to be announcing a whole lot of stuff at ConsenSys, the ConsenSys event in New York. So let me just leave that there. So we're doing deep infrastructure work for enterprise, for public blockchain, and Infura can handle up to 10 billion queries per day from the public ecosystem, including testnets and IPFS. We're also doing work towards what we believe will be the future of IT infrastructure, where instead of sort of heavy IT companies in hardware and software, you will see the granularization of the IT ecosystem, where compute, storage, bandwidth, etc., is all metered and granular and offered by you and me, and we'll have compute and storage in our phones and our jewelry and our clothing and our furniture, and we have these smart contracts that can provision for our needs and negotiate, and we'll have derivatives that can enable providers of those kinds of resources to hedge out different kinds of pricing risks, and we'll have these tokens that enable us to pay in real time for all those different kinds of IT resources. So we're envisioning a cloud and fog world, and we're doing a little bit of work on that front. We have, don't think, no, so I think it's public. So we have a project called Web3 Cloud, where we are building out hardware and software infrastructure for that kind of world. We are in a partnership with AMD, and so one could imagine building much more efficient computing devices for the virtual machines of the future.
That's awesome. Well, Joe, I have two more questions for you, and I'll let you get back to building the future, which is awesome. And one of my last questions for you is, ConsenSys changes a lot year to year, as does the industry. Do you have any expectations of what you want ConsenSys to look like in 10 years, or is the focus now on building and delivering on those goals?
Yeah, who could answer that question? So what we're moving towards is greater autonomy in all of our units. So the thesis early on was that in a world of overlapping exponential technologies, you didn't really want to build a rigid top-down command and control hierarchy to address all those opportunities. Decision-making is slow in hierarchies, and you tend to silo information and power in hierarchies. And we wanted to be as flat and fluid as possible. And we've been reasonably good at that. It's not easy to do. But I think one of the reasons that we've been able to grow so quickly and do significant things in so many different directions was because virtually all of our teams had a lot of autonomy. So when you eschew hierarchy, you lose clarity and you lose accountability. So we have a lot of our teams that have adopted what we're calling an agreements fabric. The agreements fabric involves team operating agreements and inter-team relationship agreements and team mandate agreements that specify what your mandate is and what your funding is. And within mandate and funding, there should be full autonomy. We're not there yet, but we're moving there, hopefully pretty rapidly. So the idea there is similar to a company like Amazon, where they try to have these modular functions, and they try to expose those modular functions to other modules within their organization, but also to the public, so that they have to learn and compete. And we're trying to do that within ConsenSys. One way to do that is to require all of our functional groups to publish APIs and SLAs attached to the APIs, and we're using our agreements fabric to get there. So the idea, as we play it out, perhaps over 10 years, would be that the ConsenSys mesh, the mesh of people, projects, and companies, is a lot of autonomous units that fluidly interoperate using each other's APIs, and we use a technology called OpenLaw for many of our agreements. Everybody should type OpenLaw into YouTube and check out the demos there. It is an awesome technology that enables us to create hybrid blockchain-based legally enforceable agreements with programmatic elements. So the idea there is that these APIs and SLAs take the form of these blockchain-based agreements, and at that point, anybody can come along and make use of a bunch of our services and effectively permissionlessly attach themselves to the ConsenSys mesh. So I guess we're trying to decentralize ourselves to some degree.
That's awesome. Decentralizing ConsenSys on a decentralized blockchain. I love that. So last question for you, Joe. I'm interested, and this is probably a weird question, but always interested in what keeps you awake at night, whether it's ConsenSys, future of Ethereum. I guess, what are the most pressing things that you wrestle with?
I'm not much of a worrier. So the only thing that keeps me up at night is solving problems, usually via email. I think things are going incredibly well in our ecosystem, and we are lucky to have this opportunity.
That's awesome. Joe, one more if I can. if you could have more of one thing in the industry, whether it be institutional investment, more developers, maybe more business people in the room, I guess what would you want more of if you could at a high, broad level?
To quote a famous technology leader, developers. It's still a very young ecosystem. At ConsenSys, we have a tremendous variety of different kinds of capabilities, different kinds of talents and different roles. So we've got lots of lawyers, and lots of business people, and lots of marketing people, and social impact warriors, etc. But it's all essentially bottlenecked by how fast we can mature the technology. And there's great work that can be done in building a cool application, a lot of learning that can be done in building that where the underlying technology is sufficient. But as we've seen over the last few decades, the minute you release a new generation of technology, either hardware or software, it enables just a new class of things that you can do. And so the base technology layers will always be the bottleneck.
That's awesome. Well, Joe, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please rate and review it to help other people find it. And visit delphidigital.io and use coupon code ChainReaction in all caps with no space to get an exclusive offer on accessing our research for our listeners.